Republicans, for example, complain about raising the debt ceiling when it concerns helping the least of these. Yet they had no problems with raising the debt ceiling when it concerned their agenda during the Trump administration. The Republican Party has an ideology that places the rich above the poor and middle class in the United States, and has been proven unequivocally through their tax cuts for the rich, which decrease tax revenue generation and add to the deficit, thereby causing the federal government to need an operating cash loan funded through Federal Reserve purchases of securities with money created out of thin air through computer keystrokes. And once the operating cash loan is done, it is added to the deficit. And an increased deficit means an increased national debt. And when others in Congress propose legislation to help the least of these, Republicans complain about increasing the deficit and adding to the national debt, which is hypocritical. They want to increase the deficit and national debt to help the rich, but they complain about increasing the deficit and national debt to help the poor and middle class, which makes the Republican Party a party of hypocrites when they stand up and speak hypocrisy in both houses of Congress. The Republican Party has been giving free stuff to the rich for generations, and they know they have. And the Republican free money for the rich giveaway has been done at the expense of the poor and middle class. Yet they complain about economic stimulus social programs to help the least of these. They must think the people of the United States don't understand what's going on. Republican tax cuts for the rich add to the deficit and the national debt, and places that eliminated tax revenue money into the hands of the rich, which decreases the tax revenue that would have been generated through the taxes that would have been paid by the rich. And the rich utilize that Republican free money for stock buybacks, offshore tax havens, executive bonuses and salaries, and other forms of corruption that does not benefit the poor and middle class, who are getting used as low-wage laborers and high-price-paying customers by these corrupt corporations. And these corrupt corporations benefit exponentially from this, as poor and middle-class employees provide the labor to produce the goods and provide the services for low wages, while at the same time, these poor and middle-class employees are the customers who purchase the high-priced goods and services sold by these corrupt corporations, where these poor and middle-class employees provide the labor to produce the high-priced goods and services for these corrupt corporations, who undoubtedly care nothing about the poor and middle-class people working for them. These corrupt corporations benefit exponentially from the money spread between the low wages these corrupt corporations pay their employees and the high prices these corrupt corporations charge for their goods and services. In other words, these corrupt corporations pay low wages and they charge high prices. And the money spread between the low wages and high prices are profit. You dig? All these corrupt corporations want is to get as much profit as possible through all means available to them. This is what they do. They lobby Congress and buy corrupt politicians who become bought and paid for corrupt politicians who place corrupt corporate interests above the needs of their constituents, and the corrupt corporations continue to operate in the same corrupt manner because they have bought and paid for politicians in their corner. This is trickle-down economics, which benefits the rich only, and it is time to dispose of trickle-down economics and replace it with trickle-up economics, which benefits the poor, middle class, and rich. $2,000 in monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income for all poor and middle class citizens at least 18 years of age will benefit the poor and middle class in the United States by providing them a true economic floor geared towards ending poverty and generating upward mobility. The rich will get their financial benefit on the back end from the profit they will get when the poor and middle class spend their monthly $2,000 in universal basic income. And this will result in job creation because the customer demand will make it a necessity. And as a result, corporations will be forced to hire workers at higher wages because of the fact that the profit will make this possible. A customer demand-based system will force corporations to do right with the money in order to keep their corporate operation running and big profits coming in. $2,000 in monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income will result in corporations making good profits, and the corporations will undoubtedly have happy employees as a result of trickle-up economics. Republicans also complain about a big government and giving power to the states. Either they don't know, they must have forgotten, or they don't want the people to know that the United States has already had a small national government where the states had the power. And it did not work, which is the reason for the Constitution of the United States that replaced the Articles of Confederation, which preceded the Constitution of the United States. The Articles of Confederation consisted of a small national government, and the states had the power. And an insurrection in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion proved unequivocally that big government was necessary. The insurrection caused Massachusetts to ask for help from the national government, which was powerless to do anything. Although it should have had the power to help Massachusetts, but the Articles of Confederation did exactly what Republicans today want. It gave independent power to the states and provided a small national government. As a result of this, Massachusetts had to deal with Shays' Rebellion with no help from the national government. Just think where the United States would be today if the states had the power and the federal government was small. The states would have made their own independent decisions concerning slavery. As a result, some of the states would have undoubtedly continued slavery even into the 21st century and beyond. There would have never been an Emancipation Proclamation to be signed by Abraham Lincoln. All of the states would be on their own to deal with all weather disasters, and they would have no federal government to go to ask for federal money, because these same Republicans talking small federal government ask the federal government for help when their state is in need, which is hypocritical. And these Republicans know a big federal government is necessary in order to provide for the states when they're in need. Under the Constitution of the United States, federal legislation that becomes law applies to all states in the United States and supersedes any laws those individual states may have that contradicts the federal law. In other words, all states have to follow the federal laws. This is the reason voting rights legislation is being addressed heavily at the federal level, because once federal voting rights legislation has been signed into law by the president, it will nullify all individual state laws concerning voting rights, and all states will have to obey the federal law, which will apply equally to all states. This is also the reason that people with the least of these mindset have to be elected to federal office. This bypasses having to get least of these legislation passed in each individual state, which could result in many people not receiving any money. And the people in the states that pass universal basic income could end up receiving varying amounts of money with strings attached. There would be too many variables, and time is of the essence, as federal universal basic income is necessary and should be passed and signed into law immediately. Least of these legislation passed at the federal level will apply equally to all states. So once $2,000 in United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income for all poor and middle-class citizens at least 18 years of age, funded through the Federal Reserve, is signed into law by the president, all states will have to follow the law. As I stated before, House members and senators earn $174,000 annually. House majority and minority leaders earn $193,400 annually. The Speaker of the House earns $223,500 annually. The Vice President of the United States earns $230,700 annually, and the President of the United States earns $400,000 annually. So we're talking about good-paying jobs here. Dig it? It's time to get at least of these economies started for poor and middle-class people in the United States. And it's going to take people with the least of these economic mindset to get elected to office. How many of you are struggling financially? How many of you have struggled financially in the past? How many of you are working for less than $22 per hour? How many of you feel like the corporation you're providing low-wage labor for has been getting over on you since you've been working for them? How many of you know people who are struggling financially? How many of you know people who are homeless? How many of you have friends and family attempting to live on a fixed income that is not enough for them to live on? How many of you have had enough of the government placing money in the hands of the rich through trickle-down economic policies, while your friends and family are struggling financially to make it? It is time for an economic change in the United States, and trickle-up economics is a necessity. If you have a least of these mindset and agree with the least of these legislative proposals I've covered in lectures, consider running for elective office in your district, because it is time to dispose of trickle-down economics and replace it with trickle-up economics. A least of these crew is needed in federal government. In order to get least of these legislation passed, which include $2,000 in monthly United States federal government guaranteed universal basic income, funded through the Federal Reserve, mass numbers of politicians will need to be voted out of office. Republicans and Democrats. The United States needs a government filled with people who support least of these legislation.